criticism of capitalism ranges from expressing disagreement with the principles of capitalism in its entirety, to expressing disagreement with particular outcomes of capitalism. Among those wishing to replace capitalism with a different method of production and social organization, a distinction can be made between those believing that capitalism can only be overcome through revolution and those believing that structural change can come slowly through political reforms. Some critics believe there are merits in capitalism and wish to balance it with some form of social control, typically through government regulation. Issues: democracy and freedoms. Economist Branko Horvat stated, "It is now well known that capitalist development leads to the concentration of capital, employment and power. It is somewhat less known that it leads to the almost complete destruction of economic freedom. Activists argue that capitalism leads to a significant loss of political, democratic and economic power for the vast majority of the global human population, because, they believe, capitalism creates very large concentrations of money and property at the hands of a relatively small minority of the global human population, leading, they say, to very large and increasing wealth and income inequalities between the elite and the majority of the population. Corporate capitalism and inverted totalitarianism are terms used by the aforementioned activists and critics of capitalism to describe a capitalist marketplace and society characterized by the dominance of hierarchical, bureaucratic, large corporations, which are legally required to pursue profit without concern for social welfare. Corporate capitalism has been criticized for the amount of power and influence corporations and large business interest groups have over government policy, including the policies of regulatory agencies and influencing political campaigns. Many social scientists have criticized corporations for failing to act in the interests of the people. They claim the existence of large corporations seems to circumvent the principles of democracy, which assumes equal power relations between all individuals in a society. As part of the political left, activists against corporate power and influence support a decreased income gap and improved economical equity. The rise of giant multinational corporations has been a topic of concern among the aforementioned scholars, intellectuals and activists, who see the large corporation as leading to deep structural erosion of such basic human rights and civil rights as equitable wealth and income distribution, equitable democratic political and socio-economic power representation, and many other human rights and needs. They have pointed out that, in the view, large corporations create false needs in consumers and, they contend, have had a long history of interference in and distortion of the policies of sovereign nation-states through high-priced legal lobbying, and other almost always legal, powerful forms of influence peddling. Evidence supporting this belief includes, in the view, invasive advertising, massive open or secret corporate political campaign contributions in so-called democratic elections, corporatocracy, the revolving door between government and corporations, regulatory capture, too big to fail, massive taxpayer-provided corporate bailouts, socialism, communism for the very rich and brutal, vicious, Darwinian capitalism for everyone else, corporate welfare, and, they claim, seemingly endless global news stories about corporate corruption. Anti-corporate activists express the view that large corporations answer only to large shareholders, giving human rights issues, social justice issues, environmental issues virtually no consideration. David Schweikert wrote that, in capitalist societies, ordinary ordinary people are deemed competent enough to select the political leaders but not the bosses. Contemporary capitalism celebrates democracy, yet denies us our democratic rights at precisely the point where they might be utilized most immediately and concretely, at the place where we spend most of the active and alert hours of our adult lives. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, said, "I hope we shall crush, in its birth, the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country." Franklin D. Roosevelt, in an April 29, 1938, message to Congress, warned that the growth of private power could lead to fascism. The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism: ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power. Statistics of the Bureau of Internal Revenue reveal the following amazing figures for 1935. Ownership of corporate assets. Of all corporations reporting from every part of the nation, 0.1% of them owned 52% of the assets of all of them. Quote, United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower criticized the notion of the confluence of corporate power and de facto fascism, and, in his 1961 farewell address to the nation, brought attention to the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry in the United States and stressed the need to maintain balance in and among national programs, balance between the private and the public economy, balance between cost and hoped-for advantage. Exploitation of workers. Critics of capitalism view the system as inherently exploitative. In an economic sense, exploitation is often related to the expropriation of labor for profit and based on Marx's version of the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value was supported by classical economists like David Ricardo and Adam Smith, who believed that the value of a commodity depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx identified the commodity as the basic unit of capitalist organization. Marx described a common denominator between commodities, in particular the commodities of the product of labor, and are related to each other by an exchange value. By using the labor theory of value, Marxists see a connection between labor and exchange value, in that commodities are exchanged depending on the socially necessary labor time needed to produce them. However, due to the productive forces of industrial organization, laborers are seen as creating more exchange value during the course of the working day than the cost of the survival. Marxists argue that capitalists are thus able to pay for this cost of survival, while expropriating the excess labor. Marxists further argue that due to economic inequality, the purchase of labor cannot occur under free conditions. Since capitalists control the means of production and workers control only the labor, the worker is naturally coerced into allowing the labor to be exploited. Critics argue that exploitation occurs even if the exploited consents, since the definition of exploitation is independent of consent. In essence, workers must allow the labor to be exploited or face starvation. Since some degree of unemployment is typical in modern economies, Marxists argue that wages are naturally driven down in free market systems. Hence, even if a worker contests the wages, capitalists are able to find someone from the reserve army of labor who is more desperate. Unions are the traditional method for workers to have more bargaining power in the marketplace. The act of striking has historically been an organized action to withhold labor from capitalists without fear of individual retaliation. Some critics of capitalism, while acknowledging the necessity of trade unionism, believe that trade unions simply reform an already exploitative system, leaving the system of exploitation intact. Lysander Spooner argued that almost all fortunes are made out of the capital and labor of other men than those who realize them. Indeed, large fortunes could rarely be made at all by one individual, except by his sponging capital and labor from others. Labor historian Emanuel Wallerstein has argued that unfree labor by slaves, indentured servants, prisoners, and other coerced persons is compatible with capitalist relations. Academics such as Howard Gardner have proposed the adoption of upper limits in individual wealth as a solution that would make the world a better place. Imperialism and political oppression. Critics of capitalism e.g. John Bellamy Foster and Robert W. McChesney argue that the system is responsible for not only economic exploitation, but also imperialist, colonial and counter-revolutionary wars, and repression of workers and trade unionists. Near the start of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin claimed that state use of military power to defend capitalist interests abroad was an inevitable corollary of monopoly capitalism. He argued that capitalism needs imperialism in order to survive. According to Lenin, the export of financial capital superseded the export of commodities. Banking and industrial capital merged to form large financial cartels and trusts in which production and distribution are highly centralized, and monopoly capitalists influence state policy to carve up the world into spheres of interest. These trends led states to defend the capitalist interests abroad through military power, inefficiency, or irrationality and unpredictability. Some opponents criticize capitalism's perceived inefficiency. They note a shift from pre-industrial reuse and thriftiness before capitalism to a consumer-based economy that pushes ready-made materials. It is argued that a sanitation industry arose under capitalism that deemed trash valueless, a significant break from the past when much waste was used and reused almost indefinitely. In the process, critics say capitalism has created a profit-driven system based on selling as many products as possible. Critics relate the ready-made trend to a growing garbage problem in which 4.5 pounds of trash are generated per person each day. Anti-capitalist groups with an emphasis on conservation include eco-socialists and social ecologists. Planned obsolescence has also been criticized as a wasteful practice under capitalism. By designing products to wear out faster than need be, new consumption is generated. This would benefit corporations by increasing sales, while at the same time generating excessive waste. A well-known example is the charge that Apple designed its iPod to fail after 18 months. Critics view planned obsolescence as wasteful and an inefficient use of resources. Other authors such as Naomi Klein have criticized brand-based marketing for putting more emphasis on the company's name brand than on manufacturing products. Some economists, most notably Marxian economists, argue that the system of perpetual capital accumulation leads to irrational outcomes and a misallocation of resources as industries and jobs are created for the sake of making money as opposed to satisfying actual demands and needs. Market failure. Market failure is a term used by economists to describe the condition where the allocation of goods and services by a market is not efficient. Keynesian economist Paul Krugman views this scenario in which individuals' pursuit of self-interest leads to bad results for society as a whole. John Maynard Keynes preferred economic intervention by government to free markets. Some believe that the lack of perfect information and perfect competition in a free market is grounds for government intervention. Others perceive certain unique problems with a free market, including monopolies, monopolies, insider trading, and price gouging. Inequality. Critics argue that capitalism is associated with the unfair distribution of wealth and power, a tendency toward market monopoly or oligopoly. Imperialism. Counter-revolutionary wars and various forms of economic and cultural exploitation, repression of workers and trade unionists, and phenomena such as social alienation, economic inequality, unemployment, and economic instability. Critics have argued that there is an inherent tendency toward oligopolistic structures when laissez-faire is combined with capitalist private property. Capitalism is regarded by many socialists to be irrational in that production and the direction of the economy are unplanned, creating many inconsistencies and internal contradictions, and thus should be controlled through public policy. In the early 20th century, Vladimir Lenin argued that state use of military power to defend capitalist interests abroad was an inevitable corollary of monopoly capitalism. Che Guevara wrote, "The laws of capitalism, which are blind and are invisible to ordinary people, act upon the individual without he or she being aware of it. One sees only the vastness of a seemingly infinite horizon ahead. That is how it is painted by capitalist propagandists who purport to draw a lesson from the example of Rockefeller, whether or not it is true, about the possibilities of individual success. The amount of poverty and suffering required for a Rockefeller to emerge, and the amount of depravity entailed in the accumulation of a fortune of such magnitude, are left out of the picture, and it is not always possible for the popular forces to expose this clearly. It is a contest among wolves. One can win only at the cost of the failure of others." A modern critic of capitalism is Ravi Batra, who focuses on inequality as a source of immiserization but also of system failure. Batra popularized the concept share of wealth held by richest 1% as an indicator of inequality and an important determinant of depressions. In his best-selling books in the 1980s, in the United States, the shares of earnings and wealth of the households in the top 1% of the corresponding distributions are 21% and 37%, respectively. Critics, such as Ravi Batra, argue that the capitalist system has inherent biases favoring those who already possess greater resources. The inequality may be propagated through inheritance and economic policy. Rich people are in a position to give their children a better education and inherited wealth, and that this can create or increase large differences in wealth between people who do not differ in ability or effort. One study shows that in the U.S., 43.35% of the people in the Forbes magazine 400 richest individuals list were already rich enough at birth to qualify. Another study indicated that in the U.S. wealth, race, and schooling are important to the inheritance of economic status, but that IQ is not a major contributor, and the genetic transmission of IQ is even less important. Batra has argued that the tax and benefit legislation in the USA since the Reagan presidency has contributed greatly to the inequalities and economic problems and should be repealed. Market instability. Critics of capitalism, particularly Marxists, identify market instability as a permanent feature of capitalist economy. Marx believed that the unplanned and explosive growth of capitalism does not occur in a smooth manner, but is interrupted by periods of overproduction in which stagnation and decline occur. In the view of Marxists, several contradictions in the capitalist mode of production are present, particularly the internal contradiction between anarchy in the sphere of capital and socialized production in the sphere of labor. Marx and Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, highlighted what they saw as a uniquely capitalist juxtaposition of overabundance and poverty. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. property. In discussions of the sensitive issue of property, it is critical to make a clear distinction between private property and public property. While the critics of capitalism listed discussed below are calling for the abolition of private property and its transformation into the commons or public property, they nonetheless retain respect for personal property rights. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Friedrich Engels argue that the free market is not necessarily free, but weighted towards those who already own private property. They view capitalist regulations, including the enforcement of private property on land and exclusive rights to natural resources, as unjustly enclosing upon what should be owned by all, forcing those without private property to sell their labor to capitalists and landlords in a market favorable to the latter, thus forcing workers to accept low wages in order to survive. In his criticism of capitalism, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon believed that the emphasis on private property is the problem. He argued that property is theft, arguing that private property leads to despotism. Now, property necessarily engenders despotism, the government of caprice, the reign of libidinous pleasure. That is clearly the essence of property, that, to be convinced of it, one need but remember what it is, and observe what happens around him. Property is the right to use and abuse. Many left-wing anarchists, such as anarchist communists, believe in replacing capitalist private property with a system where people can lay claim to things based on personal use and claim that property is the domination of an individual, or a coalition of individuals, over things. It is not the claim of any person or persons to the use of things, and this is usufruct. A very different matter. Property means the monopoly of wealth, the right to prevent others using it, whether the owner needs it or not. Mutualists and some anarchists support markets and private property, but not in the present form. They argue that particular aspects of modern capitalism violate the ability of individuals to trade in the absence of coercion. Mutualists support markets and private property in the product of labor, but only when these markets guarantee that workers will realize for themselves the value of their labor. In recent times, most economies have extended private property rights to include such things as patents and copyrights. Critics see this as coercive against those with few prior resources. They argue that such regulations discourage the sharing of ideas and encourage non-productive rent-seeking behavior, both of which enact a deadweight loss on the economy, erecting a prohibitive barrier to entry into the market. Not all pro-capitalists support the concept of copyright, but those who do argue that compensation to the creator is necessarily as an incentive. Sustainability. One of the main modern criticisms to the sustainability of capitalism is related to the so-called commodity chains, or production-consumption chains. These terms refer to the network of transfers of materials and commodities that is currently part of the functioning of the global capitalist system. Examples include high-tech commodities produced in countries with low average wages by multinational firms, and then being sold in distant high-income countries. Materials and resources being extracted in some countries, turned into finished products in some others, and sold as commodities in further ones. Countries exchanging with each other the same kind of commodities for the sake of consumers' choice. According to critics, such processes, all of which produce pollution and waste of resources, are an integral part of the functioning of capitalism. Critics note that the statistical methods used in calculating ecological footprint have been criticized, and some find the whole concept of counting how much land is used to be flawed, arguing that there is nothing intrinsically negative about using more land to improve living standards. Many environmentalists have long argued that the real dangers are due to the world's current social institutions that they claim promote environmentally irresponsible consumption and production. Under what they call the grow-or-die imperative of capitalism, they say, there is little reason to expect hazardous consumption and production practices to change in a timely manner. They also claim that markets and states invariably drag their feet on substantive environmental reform, and are notoriously slow to adopt viable sustainable technologies. Emanuel Wallerstein, referring to the externalization of costs as the dirty secret of capitalism, claims that there are built-in limits to ecological reform, and that the costs of doing business in the world capitalist economy are ratcheting upward because of deruralization and democratization. History. According to contemporary critics of capitalism, rapid industrialization in Europe created working conditions viewed as unfair, including 14-hour workdays, child labor, and shanty towns. Some modern economists argue that average living standards did not improve, or only very slowly improved, before 1840. Early socialist thinkers rejected capitalism altogether, attempting to create socialist communities free of the perceived injustices of early capitalism. Among these utopian socialists were Charles Fourier and Robert Owen. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels released the Communist Manifesto, which outlined a political and economic critique of capitalism based on the philosophy of historical materialism. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a contemporary of Marx, was another notable critic of capitalism, and was one of the first to call himself an anarchist. By the early 20th century, myriad socialist tendencies had arisen based on different interpretations of current events. Governments also began placing restrictions on market operations and created interventionist programs, attempting to ameliorate perceived market shortcomings. Starting with the 1917 Russian Revolution, communist states increased in numbers, and a Cold War started with the developed capitalist nations. Following the revolutions of 1989, many of these communist states adopted market economies. The notable exceptions to this trend have been North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela, the latter instituting a philosophy referred to as socialism of the 21st century.